Hello, people. Welcome to Tech Breakdown. It is a new year, and we are here with our very first episode for the year. And Tech Breakdown comes to you a bit refreshed with a bit of a new look and lots of new people we'll be speaking to, and quite a few new partners we'll be working with as well. I'm Manasa, your host. And today I have a young gun in the house or in this virtual sort of recording booth I'm in. Usually on the show, I have sort of older experts, but today we are filming a very special episode with a really, really ambitious, energetic, and extraordinary young adult. And no, he's not a tech bro with a god complex, trying to build unnecessary technologies with grand claims to save humanity. Instead, he's a very compassionate, wonderful advocate and who's fighting these very tech bros to kind of push for a better, safer online space and community, especially for young people. So drum roll, we have Zaman Qureshi. Zaman, as I've alluded to, is an activist and advocate for safer social media. He's a co-chair of the Design It For Us coalition, which is kind of the place he's representing today. And he'll be talking about the coalition in a bit. But Design It For Us is a movement of young people, of activists, of leaders trying to take on big tech. And he also happens to be a policy advisor and social media coordinator for the Real Facebook Oversight Board, which is, again, a big tech accountability group for which this interview is being filmed right now. So it's great to have you, Zaman, especially since when you're not doing small gigs like these, you seem to be meeting and speaking with really big people in big important places like the US Congress or dealing with the SEC. So thank you truly for your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Very humble. Okay. So, I mean, I was thinking kind of that you are Gen Z, right? And so I thought let's Gen Z-ize this a bit. And
Of
I was
course.
I was trying to come up with catchy ways of introducing you. And so I was thinking something on the lines of saying, sharp-looking youth icon who appears on TV and social media, who makes nerdy stuff sound cool. And, sharp because you're always wearing some sort of, one of those sharp-looking suits. But it was too long and I didn't manage to jazz it up that bit. So
No, it was a great intro. I
I
loved
can't do
it.
Gen Z even if I try it. But okay, off to serious stuff. I just want to dive in really and talk about kind of the stunt you guys pulled, Design It For Us. And there was another group called Young People's Alliance. And you guys pulled a stunt in the US Senate some weeks ago. And you were there in person at the Senate Judiciary hearing where social media company heads were called in. And so it was executives from Meta, X, formerly known as Twitter, Snap, Discord, and TikTok. And all these kind of social media company executives, including Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of kind of Meta, who owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Well, these people were being grilled by senators with regard to kind of the harms that their platforms were causing to children. And you were there in the audience along with several other people, activists. You were all wearing a T-shirt, and I'll pull up this image for people watching. And you were all wearing a T-shirt that said, "I am worth more than $270. Could you start by explaining why you were wearing that T-shirt, what it means, and kind of what you were doing there?
Yeah. So, as you said, Congress hauled in 5 powerful CEOs of social media platforms, really to try and jumpstart the year and put a focus on social media regulation and legislation. The hearing, in many ways, was very predictable. We knew generally what the CEOs were going to say. A lot of them, well, a couple of them had been there before, been in that position before. Their companies have been under intense scrutiny. So when we were thinking about the hearing, it was about thinking about how can we use this moment as an opportunity to organize and galvanize and really draw attention to our perspective in this. And so we wore T-shirts that said, "I'm worth more than $270." And that was a reference to an internal Meta email, an internal Meta study that was sent around and released in these lawsuits that 42 state attorneys general have filed against Meta for harms to children and young people. And in the lawsuits, they state that the lifetime value of a 13-year-old teenager who remains on the platform is $270 to Meta. So to us, reading that in the context of a safety and privacy discussion that was being had at the company, if employees are thinking about the worth of young people, of children, as being simply a dollar amount, then the safeguards and safety measures that are taken, that are implemented at the company, will always be subpar, because the value of profit is always going to be the center of attention. And so really the goal of wearing the t-shirts was to draw attention, to make noise about what we thought was a very big issue, but also to get Zuckerberg's attention, which he actually ended up turning around and looking at us at the direction of Senator Marsha Blackburn. It was a very weird, eerie moment where he like locked eyes with a few of us. And at the very least, I hope that he just remembers that the next time he has to make a safety or a youth policy based decision.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because not very long ago, there was another Facebook whistleblower called Arturo Bejar, and kind of he gave a testimony, and he was talking about the kind of work he was doing with Facebook when he was there, both as an employee and then as a consultant. And kind of he pulled together so much of data pointing out how bad it was for teenagers, and specifically that, you know, in the last week that they recorded when they did the research, like some 13 to 15-year-olds, around like 22% of them faced bullying, around 13% had like unwanted sexual advances. And he kind of escalated this and took it to Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, to Adam Mosseri, and basically got nothing, and Zuckerberg didn't even respond. So it was kind of weird seeing Zuckerberg turn and apologize then when he was like speaking to the Senate that day, because when it actually came to it before, he did nothing. So it was such a publicity stunt, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. And if you listen to what Zuckerberg says, I mean, we were sitting right behind him in the hearing. When he gives his apology to the parents of families who've lost loved ones due to social media harms, who've lost children due to social media's harms, you know, he says, "I'm sorry for what you've had to go through." He doesn't say, "I'm sorry for the harm that my platform has caused to you." And so even in his apology, he was unable to take accountability and responsibility for his actions, his company's actions. And so really, for me, that spoke to the kind of CEO that is at the helm of this company. I mean, he's a majority shareholder. There is nobody on the board of Meta who can outvote him. And so at the end of the day, it's him against everyone. And, you know, maybe I spoke to Arturo Bejar actually after the hearing, because he was with us throughout the day. And, you know, this is a man who has known Zuckerberg for decades, who has, you know, dined at his house and been a really key employee. And I said, "What did you think of Mark's demeanor throughout the hearing?" And Arturo said he seemed callous and dismissive, and almost sort of you know, had this air of power around him that nothing was going to be able to stop him. Like an arrogance, essentially, that, you know, why was he there? Why did he have to show up for this? He looked like he had better things to do. And in reality, there were all these parents there who had very real questions about how the harms that ultimately impacted their children's lives had been caused, and what was done in the process what could have been done in the process to prevent that from happening. So it was a very real, pretty insane moment where he turns around to the parents. But a lot of the parents were interviewed afterwards, and they were like, "That's empty unless he actually implements safeguards policy changes and backs policy that's moving in Congress.
Mm. Kind of let's backtrack a bit. And maybe you can give us a bit of a glimpse of your journey here. I mean, you're fairly young to have pulled off all the stuff you have, and this is not to discredit anything you've done, but to commend it. So it's your time to brag. And I mean, you would be a digital native, right? I'm a bit unsure about myself if I can kind of call myself that, because I wasn't on social media until I was like 15. Then it was like WhatsApp, and then I didn't get on Facebook until I was like 17 or 18 and didn't use it that much. And so my experiences with social media predominantly from my 20s. And so it would be so different from someone encountering it as a teenager or even as a child, right? So what was kind of your introduction to social media? What are your experiences around it, and kind of how that came to shape what you're doing now?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm a digital native to the extent that I had social media platforms when I was, you know, like early teen, so 12, 13, 14. This was when Instagram had chronological feed. Still, I think maybe hadn't been acquired by Facebook yet, when Snapchat was very popular. And then the precursor to TikTok, Musically, was also very popular. Um, and so these were the apps that I grew up on. And to a certain extent, like, oh, and YouTube. YouTube was the obvious one that's been ubiquitous for so many years. Um, Instagram was almost just like a carousel of images of your friends, and that was it. And it slowly evolved into this algorithmic beast that we now know it as today, with addictive features, with nudges, with dark patterns. Um, it really has evolved into a completely different platform. And I'd say that across the board, the platforms that I grew up on social media, um, they connected people. They did the thing that they were supposed to do. But as soon as companies realized that they had access to a younger market, it was about like trying to unlock that. And you don't obviously know that as like a 12-year-old, but as you get older and thinking about social media platforms as much as I do, I start to notice the things that occurred when I was younger that were indicative of the platforms getting more and more addictive. And it is interesting to sort of step back and see, as we get older, we supposedly mature and our social relationships develop, etc. But sometimes the habits that we have that are tied to our phone and our social media don't evolve. Like the same practices that we had when we were younger. I think there's a lot to be said about like being intentional about the way that we approach these platforms. But at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot of user agency that we have in being able to deal with the onslaught of algorithms targeting information at us on a daily basis. And so when you do take a step back, and these platforms had the opportunities to self-regulate for years, they've really failed to do that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here today having this conversation. Is really why outside policy change was needed and is needed. And so I came to this space because of my own experiences, because of what I had felt on social media as a young person, what I'd observed amongst my peers as young people. I came to this space because of the harms to democracy as well, the way that social media was being used and misused to influence elections. And then there was sort of that fateful time where Frances Haugen came forward and blew the whistle on pretty major allegations about the way that Meta's products were being used to target and harm young people. And throughout that entire discussion, when she first came forward, there were very little to no young people involved in that discussion. But all of this talk about what policy do we need to craft to help protect our youngest generations. And so that's where I found my way into this space from the Gen Z angle, if you will, that
Mm,
there was not enough voice to my generation and about what we thought about the way these platforms and products were used, even though we had grown up with them and almost understood them better than anyone else could. And so for me, since then, it was about A, how can I be an impactful voice in the room when it comes to policy making decisions? But B, how can I bring more young voices to the room?
mm,
And so I kept running into more and more youth activists in this space. And ultimately, in March 2023, I was like, we need to bring these voices together. And so Emma Lemke and I formed the Design It For Us coalition to really try and coalesce around certain ideas and messages and
mm.
drive policy change. But what I underestimated was the power of our collective voice, which I think has been the most impactful since we have launched Design It For Us.
Mm. We'll come to Design It For Us in just a minute, but you've kind of intuitively led us to the policy space. And kind of, I mean, as I understand, some years ago when kind of the US Congress first started looking at social media harms, like you pointed out, there were a lot of people, especially young people, who were kind of frustrated by the kind of questions that were being asked and kind of the general understanding of social media platforms that Congress people seem to have. Did you think that too? And kind of what do you think they were getting wrong at the time?
Yeah, so uh, I've always been a nerd in this space. I mean, just generally as well. But so
Well,
my practice of observing what was going on in Congress, I think was maybe a little bit different than other folks because like the first hearing, the that I think comes to memory for everyone is Mark Zuckerberg's 2018 testimony. And the general consensus, if you ask anyone who like was a journalist then or a policymaker, was that that hearing was like bit of a get out of jail free card for Zuckerberg. He kind of, comes in and has a number of silly questions asked. And in this like politically polarized environment where members of Congress are really just looking for their sound bite, the only thing that we see as passive consumers of media is those little clips. And so there was a famous one where Senator Orrin Hatch goes, Mr. Zuckerberg, if you don't have a subscription model, like how do you make money? And he like sort of smirks and goes, Senator, we sell ads. And that like went crazy. Everyone enjoyed that. But if you watch until the end of the hearing, there's actually some really pointed questions about the way that Zuckerberg and Meta, or at Facebook at the time, were running its investigation, its internal investigation into Cambridge Analytica. And so all that to say is that I think Congress has been, it's less that, there are old people asking questions about social media platforms that they have no idea how they function. There's absolutely a lot of that. But there's also this disparity that we see between members of Congress who have invested a lot of time and surrounded themselves with staff members who know about these platforms and know how to legislate. And then there's the other extreme with people who could care less and are focused on getting the soundbite on social media. The irony of that, by the way, and not caring about actually legislating for these platforms. So all in all, I think over time to come to 2024, if 2018 is the beginning, we come to 2024, there has been an evolution, a greater investment, a strategy around what creating policy in Congress looks like for technology companies. But there's also this like willful blindness and this ignorance, and to continue to drink the Kool-Aid of whatever the lobbyists are selling them in the halls of Congress.
let's come to Design It For Us, because that's the cool things you all have been doing. You already pointed out that you started it with Emma Lemke, and is it been a year now? Almost a year?
Yeah, it's coming up to a year.
That's well, congratulations. But
Thank you.
you were kind of obviously, you were already doing the tech accountability work with the Real Facebook Oversight Board, but the issue of youth safety particularly was important to you, and kind of bringing youth voices to the space was important. So you started it. And with Design It For Us, I guess it's based on the principle of kind of safety by design, right? Where kind of you believe that the best way to kind of tackle some of these social media harms would be to target the systems themselves, the way they're built, the way algorithms function, and kind of the features that are built into these platforms, and rather than kind of focusing on the after fixes like content moderation, which might not help that much. So could you talk about how you guys started it, what kind of pushed you, and also kind of some of the new things that Design It For Us is doing now?
Yeah, so we came together as really a coalition of youth activists. I mean, this really started as an idea to simply get folks who were trying to make change in this space, who are young people, in a room together and trying to see what commonalities we had in our policy approaches, in the issues that we cared about. And this idea ultimately evolved into the coalition that we now work for and represent today. Design It For Us formed on the back of the passage of the California Age Appropriate Design Code, a state bill that was signed into law by Gavin Newsom in 2022. Design It For Us was a campaign first in California and then evolved into a coalition that we now know today. We launched right around the time that my co-chair, Emma Lemke, had testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and really in a time where I think the youth voice was really needed in these policy discussions, as the shift from content moderation and antitrust and competition and privacy shifted more and more to youth safety for a number of reasons. I think partly the focus on youth safety allowed lawmakers to really attack this issue in a bipartisan way, but also the continued harms that we kept seeing from whistleblowers, from state attorneys general, from the Federal Trade Commission. I mean, the evidence right now is overwhelming in support of the idea that there are mental health correlations between the use of social media and poor mental health conditions. So our goal when we launched was to really deliver our voice to the policy conversation and discussion. We endorsed 3 pieces of federal legislation: the Kids Online Safety Act, COPPA 2.0, and the Kids Privacy Act. And that became the hallmark, focus of our first year in trying to advance those pieces of legislation. And how can we activate and bring young people into the conversation to drive some of these policy changes. In September, we also put together a first of its kind policy platform in which we circulated to lawmakers and regulators about what we felt like were core principles that needed to be thought of when crafting policy. And to your point, it was around targeting product algorithms and not sort of after use measures to try and regulate social media platforms. We were very grateful that the Federal Trade Commission really took an interest in our policy platform, and it's heavily reflected in the COPPA rulings that the FTC put out in December, at the end of December of last year, to update the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998 for the first time. And so, yeah, up to this point, Design It For Us has been very focused on making sure that we drive policy reforms and changes. Over this next year, I think that will be a piece of our work. But at the same time, this space is sort of quietly growing in a really impactful way. And so for us, it's about how can we take what has become a coalition and turn that into a movement with organic grassroots participation and the desire for young people across the country to get involved in this space, to activate and advocate for themselves. That's the goals that we see this year. And finally, the 2024 election is on everyone's mind. And social media is going to play a pivotal role, more so than any other election in our previous history. And how can we translate how young people are using social media, either for good or for harm, to the rest of the country, to the United States, and take a really, a top-down perspective in how we're thinking about the ways in which social media platforms are impacting elections from our generation.
I mean, let's maybe go to a bit more technical question. You mentioned the Kids Online Safety Act, which is KOSA, and it's probably one of the most talked about pieces of, legislation that's targeting, young people with regards to social media. What is it really about for someone who doesn't know what KOSA is, and what does it aim to do? And also, as I understand, there has been a fair amount of controversy around this bill as well. And there have been, people's viewpoints with regards, there's worry about, censorship of content, and there are people from marginalized communities, especially, say, the trans community, who've been worried about the implications of this legislation. And do you think, what are their fears, and do you think it's warranted now, given that there are new updates to the legislation?
The Kids Online Safety Act is a bipartisan piece of legislation worked on by Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn that came from originally from Frances Haugen's disclosures, and in an effort to target social media platforms, products, and algorithms. So it was less about content and more about targeting of harmful content and the ways in which products were being used to do that. A lot of the really perverse harms in this space, and that young people have experienced, who've either self-harmed, developed eating disorders, or taken their own lives, has been because a social media algorithm or product targeted content to them, because they knew that the algorithm knew that that individual was vulnerable. So the Kids Online Safety Act imposes a duty of care on social media platforms that says that you have to design your products with these key harms in mind, be that the developments of eating disorder, anxiety, depression, suicide, and really make sure that by law that your products are not harming young people in this way. And it is focused from a privacy and safety by design perspective, where you're imposing limits on the company's product and not its platform. So that was the goal of the Kids Online Safety Act, and is the goal today. The evolution of the bill, as you alluded to, this is, at the end of the day, this is legislating. This is, you're going to have a broad swath of groups from all sides of the political spectrum who come in and have a voice on this discussion. Some of those groups have things to say that are warranted. Some of them have things to say that hurt the discussion and the debate. But the reason we're seeing such a public and protracted conversation right now is that this is the first piece of tech legislation in our history in the United States government that actually has a real chance of passing, and has a better chance than any of its predecessors before them on antitrust, on privacy, on kids' safety, on content moderation, on transparency. And so because of that, it is attracting more voices to the discussion. And I do think that more voices in this conversation are necessary, but we have to keep in mind about where those voices are coming from, because the tech lobby has had a really strong hand in crafting what the discussion and debate looks like around this bill. There's absolutely a separation that needs to be distinguished between the organizations that engage in good faith and are trying to advance the bill, and the tech lobby, who literally wants to kill it, has no desire to see its passage. So for those reasons, I think the water is a little bit muddier than I think maybe the media coverage around the bill has made it out to be.
Mm.
And then by that same token, the as you alluded to, the edits that were released by Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn about 2 weeks ago now aimed to address a lot of the concerns that civil rights and civil liberties organizations brought to the table. The Kids Online Safety Act, since those edits have gone into effect, have gained 62 co-sponsors, enough to pass the United States Senate, have gained the endorsement of the NAACP, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Snap, and moved a lot of really high-level national LGBTQ plus organizations from opposed to neutral. That includes GLAAD, the Human Rights Campaign, and the Trevor Project, to name a few. They wrote in a letter to Senator Blumenthal that they were moving their position. So given these shifts over time, this at the end of the day is what, like I said, this is about legislating. And so the co-sponsors of the bill have worked really hard to get this language in a good place, to get it in the best position to pass Congress. So it has been a bipartisan approach, and from that regard, I think it speaks to the nature of how important this work is right now.
It's interesting you speak about the lobby because, well, the lobby has been quite active for many, many years. I mean, you've personally did some work on it. It's called Facebook Receives. People go and look at it, but plug in. But I mean, it's also the issue of censorship is interesting because there's certain criticism about kind of over moderation, censoring of views. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court is hearing 2 cases this week about content moderation on social media platforms, wherein kind of platforms have been accused of censorship, sort of specifically of conservative views. And so it basically, these relate to 2 laws passed in the states of Florida and Texas in 2021 that kind of barred social media platforms from, moderating content and deplatforming people. And in turn, industry groups linked with social media platforms kind of sued these states, and it has now reached the Supreme Court. And it's interesting because we've been talking this whole time about your fight for regulation, your fight for protecting young people, and showing how big tech is not moderating content properly and is failing on its promises. And on the other hand, there is also this group that believes that any moderation is kind of censorship and it's taking on big tech for totally opposite reasons. How do you kind of see both of these playing out, both these battles playing out, and what do you expect to happen in the coming year?
Yeah, I mean, it's anyone's best guess to predict what the United States Supreme Court is going to do. They had, they had a couple of other cases that came to them related to Google and Twitter recently, and they ultimately punted on those. So we have an idea of what this current court thinks about social media platforms based on those oral arguments, but we really haven't seen a judgment of any kind to allude to how they might end up ruling on this, or if they choose to rule on this. I think the interesting part of this is that the irony is that I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but the irony is that I believe these cases are being brought under First Amendment challenges, even though the goal is to increase free speech on the platform by these laws. So the way that these are going to evolve, I think, regardless of how you think about the merits of the bill, of the laws that Florida and Texas have passed, the concern that I have, and my colleague Zephyr Teachout, who worked for the Federal Trade Commission and the New York Attorney's General Office, wrote a op-ed about this in the Atlantic last week. Even though states, in our opinion, are writing, or some states are writing bad social media bills, the risk is that if you have courts setting a precedent that states cannot legislate on this issue, it hurts the ability for good laws to pass. And so that's my fear and concern, that unless we are giving states the ability to legislate, we are constantly going to be waiting for a dysfunctional Congress that is in many ways captured by the tech lobby to wait to pass something that hasn't passed anything to protect kids and teens online since 1998. Um, and we'll continue to be waiting because the states won't be able to act either.
It's pretty interesting because even though what they're arguing for is quite opposed to what you've been arguing for, you've made the case that
Absolutely.
if because it's so difficult to legislate at federal level, and it's taken so many years and so many years of effort on all your part as well, you want to protect the state's ability to kind of pass laws which might be quicker and might benefit the process. So that's quite interesting take. Anyway, I think we might stop here. I always have so many questions for you, but it was wonderful to chat to you, Zaman, as always, and continue doing all the brilliant work and kind of giving big tech the necessary scares from time to time, so they behave. And thanks for joining today and for the conversation. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.